This is a Going Back, Remembering UGA interview with Philip Lee Williams, the University of Georgia's very own Renaissance man, who over the past 4+ decades has had the opportunity to be involved with and to observe the University of Georgia from a variety of perspectives. Today, October 27th, 2015, we're visiting with Phil in his great home in Oconee County, Georgia, in what feels like the heart of a distant forest. Others with us include members of our Going Back crew, Alice Vernon and Bill Evelyn, our talented and patient videographer, and I'm Fran Lane. Phil, thank you so much for allowing us to drop in today. We appreciate very much your willingness to share your memories with us and spend some time.
Delighted. Thank you so much.
Let's start at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about the wonderful Williams family and growing up in Madison, Georgia.
Well, our family was very much affected by the fact that my parents were both able to go to college on the GI Bill. Mm-hmm. They both were in service during World War II. My father was in the Army Air Forces and my mother was in the Waves, so with the Navy. So they both had their education paid for. They lived in Oconee County, South Carolina, and they would have gone to Clemson University, which was the closest university there, but it was not co-ed at the time. So the next closest place was the University of Georgia. So they applied here, were admitted with a trillion other people in 1946, right after the war. They moved to Athens in January 1946. And so they both, had college degrees. And with my brother and my sister and I growing up in Madison, where my father taught at the high school, he taught chemistry and physics. We were a little unusual in that both of our parents were college graduates. We lived in a very rural life. We lived sort of out in the country, and so we had the good parts of a rural childhood along with intellectual access to classical music, art, and all sorts of things. My mother loved Shakespeare. They could both quote reams of poetry because that's how people used to be educated. But my father painted, he played the piano, but he was also a great scientist. He majored in chemistry at the University of Georgia. In fact, as of today, he's the oldest living chemistry graduate from the University of Georgia. And I've taken him several times to their annual banquet, and where he's feted as being the oldest graduate because he graduated in 1948.
He was a Renaissance man too.
Very much. And he, I tell people all the time, they look at who I am and what I do, and I'm going, I didn't do anything special. I just did what my family did. I mean, my brother and I both did. My sister did too. So, we were all part of a family where education was expected, but we were being educated long before we actually went away to college to the University of Georgia. But it was it was a great place to grow up. I loved Madison, still do. Back then in the 50s, it was kind of a quiet little place, but we had a great football team. My father started at the high school in 1953 and became principal in 1955 and was principal for 5 years before he left that to do something else for a lot of reasons, mainly because he wasn't getting paid enough to keep a family together. But later, we just, it was just a wonderful place to be. And I think everything about who I am came from growing up in the country outside of town. I spent a lot of time in the woods by myself, which was a great pleasure, but it really was my personality. And here I am, 60 years later, actually. Back in the woods.
Mm-hmm. I was so touched by things that you said about the people who influenced you. Talk a little bit. I know your parents were huge influences. There were other people who also influenced you. Talk a little bit about some of those early influences.
Well, in my family, obviously, my grandmother, my grandfather, I was a little unusual because I only had two grandparents. My father's parents both died before I was born. My father died when he was my father's father died when he was 12 years old, and he was raised by his mother and an aunt who had never married. And so, and his mother died 3 years before I was born. So I just had two grandparents and lived in Seneca, South Carolina. They were a big influence in a lot of ways. My mother was incredibly smart, was very funny. A lot of my sense of humor comes from my mother. In fact, I would say a great deal of it does. She had a real keen sense of of how idiotic the world can be, and had a wonderful laugh, and she really, really loved it and encouraged it when I would do something funny, even reading jokes from the back of Boy's Life to get attention. And so, my parents, my grandparents, aunts and uncles, and so forth. In Madison, there were just tons of people. I knew the parents of all my friends, of course, and I sort of grew up in their houses too. In high school, I was fortunate to have some really, really great teachers who made a big difference in my life. One that comes to mind is Florence Wagnon, who taught me French and senior English. And she was, and everybody who ever had her says the same thing, she was probably one of the best 2 or 3 teachers I ever had in my life. She was absolutely impartial. She did not care whether you thought she was wonderful or horrible. She taught you exactly the same. But that was a very attractive thing to me. I loved being pushed and challenged and not being given anything and made to work for it, because and I think that's one thing I got from my parents too, was a sense that anything that I was going to ever get, I was going to have to really work hard for. Most of the time they didn't have much money at all, and in fact when I graduated from college from the University of Georgia in 1972, they gave me as a gift all they could afford, which was $40 to buy a suit. So I wouldn't look too grubby in my first job. But money was never discussed in my family, ever. And it was never about what job are you going to have. It was about who you are, what are you going to learn, and isn't it wonderful that Beethoven wrote his 9 symphonies? Isn't it wonderful that Rubens and Rembrandt painted what they painted, and that the world of the arts and the sciences is so much fun. My father used to build bombs. I don't know what the ATF would make of this now, but he used to build bombs to teach high school physics students about the speed of sound. And they would blow them up small, but they were actual bombs at one end of a big field, and then they could measure the length of time it took from seeing the flash to hearing the explosion. And so, and he had an electronics shop in our home. He was always building things, always. And so I grew up with an equal passion for literature and music and science, which is a real odd combination. But there were so many people in school and so many people in Madison. The football team was a big influence, oddly enough. We won the state championship 5 years in the 50s and the early 60s, and they haven't since.
Was that Mr. Bill Corey? Was he?
It was Bill Corey. He was, in fact, my father hired him against the advice of a lot of people. He had never been a head coach before. And he just passed away a couple of years ago. But our family was friends with the Coreys forever, and I'm still friends with their kids, and who are a little younger than me, but So, and all the people, when my father was in school, all the people in the high school we knew real well, and I was always up there. So I grew up in the high school, so to speak. So education was something that was always a huge part of who I am. Particularly growing up in Madison, but being successful financially was never even brought up, and I knew that when I graduated from college that I was going to have to make it my own way, because I knew my parents had no money to give me. But I just kind of stubbornly went about making it up as I went along, and and I remember one time I was about I guess I was a junior in college. And my father asked me I was down there one weekend, and my father asked me if I had decided what I wanted to be, what my career wanted to be. And I said, yeah, I think so. And he said, what? And I said, I think I want to be a poet. And, normally, this is where the father hits you in the head with something really hard. But he said, that's pretty neat. How are you going to do that? And my mother was like, yeah, I think you could do that. I think you could be good at being a poet. I mean, can you imagine any parent saying that to their kids?
I just think how lucky you were.
Well, I mean, and they made me feel like it was a worthy thing to spend my life doing. How I was going to put food on the table was another matter. But I knew that was going to be up to me. So I knew nobody was going to help me. So, I was ready. By the time I, grew up, I was ready to make my own way. And then I met Linda, and we made it together.
I think the other thing that I particularly noticed as you talked about people who influenced you, and a couple of other people you mentioned Kathleen Reed, mm-hmm. who was the music teacher in Madison, and that was a love of yours.
She was, Kathleen was, my brother started taking piano when he was very young and hated it. He didn't like it. He didn't want to be a pianist. And as it turned out, he turned out to be quite a good musician. But he plays bass and guitars and things like that, and bands and so forth. But my bent was much more towards classical. I loved classical music from the time I was a small kid. And but because they'd had a not so good experience with my brother Mark, they weren't going to make me take piano. And I had to beg. And finally, when I think I was 13, they finally broke down and said, okay, we'll pay for piano lessons with Kathleen Reed, who lived right through the woods. It took me like 90 seconds to walk to her house. And she was a spectacularly gifted organist and pianist and a wonderful human being. And she used to teach at the high school. And in fact, I think my father had hired her too. And so I took piano with her for maybe 4 or 5 years, and she was very patient with me because I could get really, really off the subject and away from what we were trying to do. But she understood that even then that my interest was in creating things rather than playing the piano. I wanted to be a composer and a writer or something like that. I wanted to make things, I've often said if my parents had not come to the University of Georgia or gone to college, maybe I would have been making engines. Who knows? Mm-hmm. But I would think that sense of wanting to build something is kind of innate. But Kathleen understood certainly, who I was and where I was coming from, and she encouraged it.
Lucky in many ways, but yeah, I think also you show you write your appreciation for those people who mentored you, befriended you, guided you, and I think that's a great thing. All of us need to be doing a little bit more of that these days. So, all right, let's talk about beginning at the University of Georgia. You knew from the beginning that's where you were going, right?
The University of Georgia was the only place I even applied. It never occurred to me, literally never occurred to me to think about applying anywhere else. My parents had gone there. My older brother Mark was already there. I mean, I was going to the University of Georgia. It was just very simple. It was a given. I had been around UGA for a long time by then. I was a freshman in 1968, but I remember my father, for various and sundry reasons, visiting campus when I was a kid. I remember one time I was walking on North Campus and Dr. Adderhold came by and saw me. Must have been 9, and I was just kind of hanging out. And he stopped and sat down on a bench with me, and we chatted for 15 minutes. And I knew who he was because I'd seen his picture in the papers, and I knew he was, like famous. I mean, he was really famous to me. And I couldn't believe he was talking to me, but he couldn't have been kinder or nicer. And I said, yeah, someday I'm going to be a student here. My parents both are graduates and everything. So I knew the campus, and of course it was much smaller. But my parents told stories all the time of what Athens and the university were like in 1946 and when they first came to Athens. So I had it in my head, what Prince Avenue looked like before they started tearing down all the old homes over there and destroying the entire place. They graduated from an amphitheater that is where grad studies is now, right there. And the only thing over there was Connor Hall, I guess, maybe in the Rock House. Maybe a few other things, but not much. I think there was some military housing past it that
became married housing
there during the war and became married housing.
Yeah.
But there was not much on South Campus. But I knew all this stuff in my head about what the university looked like going back to the 40s. And then years later, I got to know Dean Tate real well. He and I became buddies, and he brought his column into the Athens Observer every Monday for a couple of years before he died. That's my story. Maybe I should tell in a different place. But at any rate, Dean Tate started in 1920, and he used to tell me stories all the time about what the university was like in the 20s and 30s and on. And so I've always had this sense of continuity with the university that goes way back, and have known people, getting close to 100 years now of UGA history. And my own parents, 70, this coming January of 2016, will be 70 years that they moved to start at the University of Georgia. So there was never any question where I was going. And I was a gigantic UGA football fan, massive. And we saw the very first UGA game that was ever broadcast, the 1965 game against Alabama, the famous flea flicker play, and me and 20 million other people. But, we were like, my brother and I were both, couldn't breathe on Saturdays because Georgia was playing. And I still probably, it's been, either I've been on the road or something, the only times that I have missed a Georgia game. I don't go much anymore because it's so easy to sit in your living room and watch them on TV. But we have been big Georgia fans. I've been a big Georgia fan for 55 years, I guess I'd say. So, yes, one and only university that I ever thought about going to.
In 1968, and you talked about the way it had changed over the years, I started in the fall of 1965. There were 12,000 of us on campus in 65. In 68, there were 20,000 of us. So in the course of 2.5, 3 years, there was this massive baby boomer explosion. Did you get was there a feeling of that? I know at that point they brought in a lot of new faculty that year, and there was some of that traditional faculty, some of that new faculty trying to work together. I don't know if you ever witnessed any of that.
When I started, the thing that I really remember, and it had a lot to do with my experience of UGA, was that I started out as a freshman. I spent 1 quarter, and we were on quarters then, of course, in Park Hall, and really truly hated it for a lot of reasons. Everybody stayed up all night. Always have been and still am an early to bed, early to rise person, and you can't do that in a dorm.
Reed Hall.
Reed Hall, I'm sorry.
Reed Hall.
Not Park, English department. Thank you very much for correcting that. Reed Hall, and so I only stayed there for 1 quarter. Plus, I paid for most all of my college myself, working in the summers and saving my money. My parents would have to help me out a little bit every spring because I would always run out of money. But I realized that in order to get through college, because my brother was in college too, and they really weren't able to help either one of us, that I was going to have to either get a job and work most of the time and then go to school, or live at home. And my father worked at UGA by then as an electronics design engineer. He had started there in '67. So I could commute with him every day. He commuted from Madison. So I thought about it, and so I decided that starting winter quarter of 68 or 69 that I would live at home and commute with him. And it worked out beautifully, mainly because I had a lot of friends, tons of friends who lived in Athens, and I was always spending the night with them. I would say, I would call him and say, I'll be home Friday. I'm spending the 3 days with Larry or whatever, or Edward. And so, it allowed me to sow some wild oats, and boy, we sowed some wild oats, and have fun, and meet people and meet girls and everything. And at the same time not spend remotely as much as I would have spent otherwise. Now, what the university was like in 1968 for me, I came out of a very conservative atmosphere. My father was very conservative, my mother a little more moderate, but Madison was traditional, although a little progressive for its time. But I didn't know anything, really, and had no real way to do it. It was so long ago. But I was shocked by what was in the zeitgeist that I didn't know was there, and that there was this whole different world of different opinions out there that I had never been exposed to in my life, and that I was going to have to decide which way I wanted to go, what I believed in, what I thought, and that everything that I had had up to that point was not going to do me any good. And I remember I got it was a political science class when I was a first quarter freshman that I got asked a question, and the answer I gave was a typical answer my father would have given. And I got shouted down by a bunch of really angry students who were older than me and who were much more progressive, shall we say, although UGA in '68 was certainly not a progressive place. But it was starting to get there. And I realized at that point, I had to ask myself, do I have any idea what I'm talking about? And I had to go think about it. And in the meantime, I was starting out as a music major. I really thought that's what I was going to do with my life. And it took me 1 quarter to realize that I was going to wind up either as a band director or a church choir director, neither one of which I wanted to do. I was, against all good sense, I was ambitious. Makes no sense to have been ambitious, for me to have been ambitious, because I'd accomplished nothing and really didn't have any skills that would have made me think that I could. But I had a real stubborn streak, and I had that Depression era self-reliance hammered into me by my parents. In fact, my father had given me, when I was a teenager, Emerson's essays and said, "Here, read these and then we'll talk about them." And I was like, "Yes, sir." And I did, and they were life-changing to me, and I still love Emerson. And so the university was getting bigger. It was exploding. There were new faculty. There were a lot of young faculty, and I had some of them, and they were good. I had just a handful. In all my years at UGA as an undergraduate and graduate school, I had a bare handful of what I would call bad professors, maybe actually only 2 or 3. I had a lot that were very good, and I had an unusual amount that I thought were terrific, and I had a handful that were life-changing. And so it was changing fast. That's the thing I remember, is that in 1968, the university still, on the one hand, was sort of like a Janus figure, with the 2 faces, one facing forward and one facing back. There was still the part of it that was facing back, tradition, history, and everything. And I joined the men's glee club, so I immediately had to learn all the UGA songs, which I can still sing.
I ask you to do that.
No, I won't. But I can occasionally. I'll break into one when my grandkids are over here, and they look at me like I'm from Mars. But I can still sing all the UGA fight songs that go back to the 19th century.
Georgia, Georgia, hear the bulldogs growl.
Yeah, I know that one. I know all of them, but it's embarrassing, sort of. But at any rate, there was that tradition. There was a pull for that, but there was also a tremendous sense of worry about the war. It was really heating up, and we were going to have college deferments. Those of us who were in college weren't going to get drafted, which seemed insane. It seemed unfair, even to me then, and I wasn't about to go join, but it seemed crazy, and we had a sense that it was not going to last. So there was a real, and I know you remember what it was like, but there was a real sense of coming ferment. Something was about to happen. There was a real sense that something was about to happen, but it hadn't happened quite yet, not at UGA. It was happening on campuses all over the country elsewhere in 1968. Right. And in 1968, I remember when Dr. King was assassinated, I had just graduated from high school. My mother knocked on my bedroom door and woke me up and told me about Bobby Kennedy being shot.
Mm-hmm.
And she was really upset. I remember that. My mother was. And she was, I mean, she voted conservative like my father did, but she was, you know, it was like sort of the world was ending. It was just a horrible, horrible year and a horrible time. But, you know, when you're a freshman in college, you think about yourself and everything. So the University of Georgia was a place I knew. I knew the buildings. I pretty much knew where everything was. It was, I guess to some people, it would seem big if they hadn't been to a university before, but it was very familiar to me. I'd been there a million times, and so it wasn't. And after the first quarter, I was living at home, so it was very comfortable. I was never worried, afraid, or anything. It took some adjusting to get used to, but I just, you know, was there, and the thing I remember most was how quickly everything started changing. By the following year, I started in the September of '68 at the university. By '69, all the guys' hair was suddenly getting long. The girls were wearing long dresses and granny glasses, and it was a totally different place, and it was so much fun. It was so much fun. And I really, at that point, thought, I'm not going to turn my back on this. You know, I'm going to find out what is out there in this world and other parts of the world and everything. I want to, you know, we're only here for a blink, and I really want to learn and be involved with everything I can. So I just jumped right in, and it was, you know, I started going to protests, and you know, made friends with people who had different ideas from the kind I grew up with. And it was, I honestly think a lot of it, I mean, we told ourselves, I think, that we were making a difference, you know, very much like the Big Chill. All of the guys in the Big Chill are a little bit older than me. Mm-hmm. But the truth of the matter is, we just had a great time. It was a lot of fun. And and we were terrified. The guys particularly were scared to death because of the war. And after the first draft lottery, you know, I saw the lottery live at the varsity downtown. There were 1 million kids in there. I was in there. And they read out the first birthday, the first of number one, and a kid down in front jumped up, swore, and ran out. He had been called as the very first one.
Talk about exactly how that worked, because I don't think we've done that.
The lottery, when I was in college at the University of Georgia, and I think it was in 1970, we had the first draft lottery. Up until that point, college students had been able to have a college exemption. You know, you weren't allowed to be drafted if you were in college, which is nuts. I mean, there's just no way around it. It was a crazy idea to think that made somebody exempt from military service, because it put the burden of fighting the war on the poor and minorities and everything, which the Vietnam War stayed, unfortunately, for a long time. And, of course, it was, in retrospect, a war we should never have gotten involved with, but that's ancient history to most everybody now. But they decided that they were going to get rid of the college deferments, that there would be a draft, and that you know, they would have a lottery, and you know, there would be they would spin a canister with with all the 365 days of the year in it. They'd pull it out, and you know, I forget what the first one was. It's online. I actually looked it up when I was writing my autobiography, but you know, and they would pull out every one and read it. And you know, if you were January the 5th, you might be number 5, or you might be number 312, or whatever. But the further away you were, the less chance it was that you were going to be drafted. I was a sophomore, and I was, you know, and my brother was a senior, and his draft number was like 80 something, and he knew he had no choice, so he joined the Air Force. Spent 4 years in the Air Force. He served stateside. He was lucky, but it was 4 years out of his life that I think he really hates that he lost. And but for me, all I could do was just sit and watch. And as it turned out, my number was like 180 something. And so, in fact, I had to go to class. I didn't stay and see what my number was, and I didn't know until it was published in the papers the next day when the whole list was. And so I just thought, okay, I think maybe I'm not going to have to serve at that level, because they weren't anywhere near that at the time. So, I just kind of played it by ear at that time, but then they instituted a thing where you could change your own category if you wanted to. You could either go 1A. They'd be glad for you to go 1A, but they instituted a rule where if you went 1A of any part of a calendar year, on the following January the 1st, you would go into a holding pool, an H pool. Then they would have to call 1 through 365 of the current draft class, and then back up to your number before they ever got to you, which effectively meant you would never get drafted. You would never get called. So in December, I think it was 1971, I went 1A. I went to my draft board and said, I want you to reclassify me 1A. They knew why I was doing it. A lot of guys were doing it, and it was an open thing, and everything. So they reclassified me 1A. And on January the 1st, I went into the holding pool, and I never got called. But all during school, we did not know what was going to happen. The war was scary. There were people from my hometown who were killed in Vietnam, and it was just fearing that affected everything. It affected everything that we did when we were in college. And not only that, ROTC was required for all male students the first year I was there. It had been forever. Your only choice was Army or Air Force. I went in the Air Force because my dad was in the Air Force, and my brother was going to join the Air Force. So I went into Air Force ROTC. I was in it for a year. And then the Supreme Court had a ruling, and they ruled that mandatory ROTC at federal land-grant colleges was against the Constitution. And so they got rid of the program, and the 2 ROTC programs at UGA, which had been gigantic, collapsed down to almost nothing overnight. I mean, just like that, they were all but gone. And all of that was stuff that was, while you were taking classes, while you were learning friends, while you were trying to find a mate, while you were, getting messed up in ways you never should have done, and you hope your parents never find out about. I did a lot of that. While you were trying to find a future, while you were trying to find what you were good at and what you loved, you also were fighting against this horrible war thousands of miles away in so many ways. It wasn't just the idea that you would have to go fight. It was always in our minds. And because of that, everybody just kind of thought, to heck with this, following the rules. Following rules got us where we are right now, which is a gigantic, disastrous mess. And so maybe we ought to just make up the rules. And that's where, the campus unrest really started. And I was always, starting in high school and all the way through college, one of those people who always knew when to pop the chute. And I almost never got into trouble. I had so many friends who got into trouble for various and sundry malfeasances over the years, and I came out clean as a whistle because I was always, because I didn't have much.
You left the party at 10.
Yeah, I mean, I was always the one who could be counted on to clear up messes and to get things right and everything. But I also, was capable of doing some pretty stupid things too. So, but it was the University of Georgia. When I started there, was a tremendously exciting place. It got more exciting every year. By 1972, when I graduated, I think it had started to ebb a little bit. The fear of the war was dying. Because it was pretty clear that I think the draft had ended by then, but it was clear that that we're going to have to worry about our futures. We're going to have to get jobs. What were we going to do? So, but it was a place I'd known since I was a child. It was a place my parents had been, and this is true of. I run into people all the time who are in the same situation I'm in, whose families have gone for generations and have such deep roots with the University of Georgia, but. I wouldn't give anything. I wouldn't trade anything for my 4 years as an undergraduate at UGA. It was an exciting time. It was a time that made me who I am, that changed almost everything I believed, and gave me a real education. And by that I mean so far outside the classroom. What I got in the classroom was great, but what I got outside the classroom in the context of the day, in the context of that very rich and horrible time, probably had more to do with making me than anything else.
Don't you think that every one of us who sent a child off to college hopes maybe that they will have that kind of experience, come through, how about this, come through safely through that kind of experience, that's what college ought to be?
I have always felt that, and we encouraged both of our children, my wife Linda and I did, to explore and not be afraid, and to enjoy. Our daughter Megan just graduated, and last year I told her, I said, "Sweetie, if you can't have fun when you're a senior in college, there's no hope." I said, this is the time that you got all your core classes out of the way, you're doing major stuff, and both of my children majored in history, a completely useless degree, and one that makes us so proud of them, and we actively encouraged them to go to the University of Georgia, not to get a job, but to get an education, because that's what we were encouraged to do. And we told both of them, a job will come. You will figure that out, but an education won't if you don't go get it. And so we feel very, very pleased with the education that they got. And our son Brandon is now in charge of IT for the School of Art and the School of Music, and has been there for 13 and a half years, and he spent his last year running the IT labs for the classics department with Rick LaFleur. And Rick was a friend of mine, so I pitched Brandon to him, and so Brandon wound up working over there, and one thing led to another, and with his history degree he wound up doing IT work. But it's just so good. It's such a to be encouraged to make the college experience something that's about growing up and about education, and not about using it as your job training place. If I want to do job training, I'd go to Athens Tech.
Amen. Amen to everything you've said. We talked a little bit, certainly talked about Vietnam hanging over those years. Talk a little bit about, do you remember the women's movement and the things that were going on in that era?
Yeah,
I
remember the women's movement very well, and it was nascent. I mean, it was just very, very new when I was in college. It actually got bigger later. And the newspapers I was in, because of my interests, were actively supported the Equal Rights Amendment. And that was one of the things I think that drew me to Linda. Linda was this, I grew up with these wonderful, wonderful girls and women who I still adore and who are still friends of mine and everything. But I was really looking for a wife or a partner or whatever, for somebody who was a lot different from what I knew. And Linda grew up in Boston, and she was tough and smart and gorgeous, and I had never met anybody like her before. She had a real potty mouth. She smoked Vantage cigarettes. She just was she had long hair. She drank beer. She smoked and drank at her parents' house, which I couldn't fathom. And I would go over there and spend weekends, in the bedroom with her little brother, and we'd, by noon, somebody would pop a beer, and I'm like, this is like Mars compared to Madison, Georgia, and my parents at the time were teetotalers and Baptists and always had been, So I learned a lot of what I got about the women's movement and about the fact that women had been oppressed for so long in so many ways. It originated with Linda, because she, when I first met her, she was dating a guy, a graduate student in the philosophy department, which is typical. She was 20 and dating a graduate student. That would be like her. And I really had to work really, really, really hard to get her away from this guy, but I did. But the whole time we were dating and everything, we were very much aware that something was happening with the women's movement in the country and everything. And we read everything we could find out. She was one of the very first class that got a certificate in African American studies. No, African studies, I'm sorry. It was African studies. There had Chinua Achebe and people like that and everything. And she got a picture in the paper and everything. It was like 5 of them. It was the first African studies certificate, and I think it was in 1971. And she had to take certain classes and do certain things to get the certificate. But she was very proud of that. But together we learned a lot about the place of women in our society and what had happened. And the more I learned about everything, the lower my opinion of men got. It got to the point where I was just kind of embarrassed to walk out of the house. But we changed things too. We started, even when we were very young, we started giving what we could give to causes. And for decades, it was almost nothing, but we were consistent in supporting things that we believed in. And that certainly was I know you remember this, Fran, 1967, I think, was the last year that co-eds at the University of Georgia had to wear raincoats over their gym shorts to go from building to building. I mean, it was nuts, and what was that about? I mean, that would should have been have embarrassed the university in 1930, but 1967 it was a joke, and but finally it was a joke that came to an end.
Phil, talk a little bit. I know you talked about early influences, but talk about some of the influential faculty, memorable faculty for you at the university.
Well, there were so many, and some of them I remember their faces and can't really remember their names, which makes me kind of sad. But certainly, if I had to pick one faculty member who was most influential to me and who I would say that meant the most to me, it would be George Marshall in English. George was a great lecturer. He was a brilliant man. He wrote several books. He was a Victorian literature specialist. And something about him I knew I liked immediately, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I didn't find out until we got to be real good friends years later that he had started out as a journalist like I had, or like I was going to do. And that he had actually started work at the Madisonian in Madison, Georgia, the newspaper where I started. So I just felt like I got George. And it's a thing that you can't put your finger on. You professors that mean a lot to you. But he just was really a great guy and a great professor. Coleman Barks was a professor of mine, and Coleman and I became buddies years later and did a lot of gigs together as writers and everything. And Coleman, I think his first book came out when I was a senior there. Harper and Row published his first book of poetry, The Juice. And I think 40-something years later, I still had a copy that wasn't signed, and I took it to him and I said, "Autograph this for me." He said, "Good Lord, I haven't signed one of these in decades. This may be the last time this ever happens." But Coleman was a real inspiration because he was a working writer, working to be a creative writer in a day when creative writing was not rewarded. If you were an English professor, it was considered sort of a hobby, but you were supposed to do scholarly research. And Coleman, of course, turned out to be an internationally known translator of Rumi and poet in his own right. But he was a great poet. He was young. He was very young at the time. Linda had him before me. She's the one that told me about him. And Jim Kilgo was somebody I had. Linda had him before me, too. She kept talking about Mr. Kilgo because he taught her before he finished his PhD. And I said, "Who is this Mr. Kilgo?" She said, "You will have to meet him. He's brilliant. He understands the outdoors. He's not like me, maybe politically, I don't know." And he was. And Jim and I never could get straight whether I had him in graduate school or as an undergraduate. But he was a teacher of mine. Marion Montgomery was somebody that I had. I'm pretty sure I had Marion in graduate school, but we were friends forever after that and stayed friends. And of course, I knew Marion's kids from working at Greater Georgia Printers when I was at the Madisonian and at the Athens Observer, because that's where we printed our papers. and Marion lived in Crawford, right there where Greater Georgia Printers was. So they were all teachers that had a huge influence on me. Lee Canet in history was a huge influence on me too. He was a specialist in the French Revolution and other things, and a brilliant writer. He wrote a lot of books, and he was that were reviewed very well in national media as well as history publications. But he was like awe-inspiring. He knew so much, but he was a great lecturer, very responsive, and I'm not sure I ever had a professor who loved his material more than he did. He was just madly in love with what he taught, and it was just exhilarating. It was intoxicating. In journalism, I had a guy named Larry Aldridge who was a piece of work, and he taught me, he gave me, his class was the only creative writing class, so to speak, that I ever had in my whole life. And it was a magazine writing class. And he was tough, but very, very, very funny and extremely offbeat and a little weird, but right up my alley at that time. He did not like authority. He actively thought it was cool if you did something that was against the man, so to speak. But we had a lot of fun in that class, and I wrote a piece of journalism in there. It was the first thing that I ever wrote that I was really proud of, and it was a story about the time I was almost eaten by a shark when I was snorkeling in the Florida Keys, and he loved it, and I think I got an A on the paper. I think that was my final paper, but Larry was great. Worth McDougall was somebody else who I loved. I had Worth for a class called Radio TV Station Management. I mean, if you can just think about that for a second, the title of that, and these were quarters, 12 weeks or whatever. I mean, it was just a little, you're supposed to learn how to manage a radio or a TV station in this teeny little bit of time here. So Worth comes in and says, I got to go do Peabody stuff. Here's your assignment. I'll be back in 6 weeks, or something like that. And he did, but he was great. He stayed up with all of us. And even in the limited time that I had him because of that quarter, because of his Peabody duties, I got something from him. And I just really, really, really liked him. He also was somebody who was madly in love with what he did. And it just radiated off of him. He just, you had a sense of it. There was another professor whose name I don't know. I would wish I could go back and find out. But I took a geography class. It was a human geography or something. I forget what it was. It was a science requirement. And in the GGY building, or whatever it was called. And they had a teacher who was only here for 1 quarter from New Zealand. And he was young, but he was extremely nervous. And he wore a very upright, wore his tie, and everything in a suit. And but after a couple of classes, we all just thought he was totally wonderful. And he was a great teacher. But the thing that I remember about him was that he desperately wanted us to learn what he was teaching us. He wasn't just doing his job. He really wanted to make his time in Athens, Georgia, on his exchange program, whatever it was, from New Zealand, mean something. And man, what a class that was. At the end of the quarter, I remember, we got together and wrote a letter to the head of the department praising him. And he opened it in front of the class and read it. And I can't believe I'm getting emotional about something.
Made him cry.
But it was a great experience. And I had, just tons of other teachers who were great. I had a lot of teachers in music. I guess one of the ones that was hugely influential to me was Pierce Arant. Pierce was disgusted with me because I came to UGA as a voice major, and I think I probably could have done pretty well, but I really had a sense that this was the wrong thing for me immediately. And but I stayed in men's glee club, which Pierce also taught. And I remember the first day that I came into men's glee club, he said, and it was this big rowdy group, and it was not at all what you'd think a men's glee club would be like. And the first thing he said was, "Gentlemen, up until now, the University of Georgia Men's Glee Club has been a no-credit, raise hell class. From now on, it will be a 1-hour raise heck class." And everybody laughed, and he had everybody at that moment, but he was a great, great, great teacher. I mean, a great teacher. Maybe one of the best choral teachers that ever lived in this country.
Was and is a great glee club.
It is, and it was it had, it already had a tradition from Byron Warner, and I knew that. What was the name of his daughter? Flo was in a
Florence Warner.
She was in a musical group that had a big hit.
She and her two brothers.
Yeah.
Well, her brother and maybe somebody else.
Yeah, and but they were great. But see, all these people, my parents knew all these first generation founders and everything. I mean, Hugh Hodgson taught my mother music appreciation. And they also had classes from other sort of founders and everything. So Pierce was just a great teacher, and the men's glee club was a rowdy bunch. I mean, we were, you'd think it would be sort of all artistic types. Not at all. Not at all. There were a lot of fraternity types, a lot of sort of jock types. It was just the thing that joined us was that we loved to sing, and so it was an odd bunch. And but we were great under Arant. I mean, we were really, really, really fine. But we were fine. We were fine because he made us work like dogs, and I mean, it was brutal. It was really, really, really hard. When we rehearsed, there was no fooling around. We worked really hard, and if something wasn't happening, we stopped until it got right. And it was a real learning experience.
Well,
and
it's like being on the football team together.
It very much so, and we bonded. We were all great friends, and went on tour. We made a record.
Hung out
an
every
LP,
chance you got.
Hung out. Told stories about girlfriends, and I didn't have stories to tell for a while until I met Linda. But well, I had girlfriends, but they didn't last for one reason or another. But that's another story.
Any other extracurricular things you were involved in?
Oh gosh, actually, I was not then, and never have been much of a joiner.
You never worked for the Red and Black, or
never.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and I get asked that question all the time. And I was recently named a Grady Fellow and honored with the fellows at their last their centennial gathering, and which made me very happy that my college remembered me, since I did so little to make them remember me. My college, not my university. My university's been very kind to me, but I was never with the Red and Black. I didn't do it. I was always going back and forth between Madison and here, or hanging out with friends, and there really wasn't a good time for me to do anything else other than go to school.
You had plenty going on.
So, and by that time I also was starting to want to be a writer. I'd already I'd been composing since I was 14. So, I had a lot of things that were going on, but UGA was just a great place. I mean, I had so much fun in those 4 years as an undergraduate, and I wouldn't trade anything in the world for them. It meant everything.
Talk just briefly, and then we're going to move on to some other things, Phil, but talk briefly about what life as a was it a TV directing? Was that what your major was? What was life like as a major in that?
Well, you know, it was a crazy thing for me to do. I honestly, the truth of the matter was, I started out as a music major, realized immediately, halfway through the quarter, and I was taking a brass methods course from Al Ligotti, and who had just come to UGA from the New York Philharmonic, and I realized that I didn't want to do this. I did not want to do it, and Al was so kind and patient with me and nice, and he should have just kicked me out of his class. But by the time that I had finished his brass methods class, and by the time I had finished all of that, I realized I had to get out because this is not what I was supposed to be doing. And that's what you go to college for, you know, is to figure out where you fit.
And sometimes it takes figuring out where you don't fit.
And I had planned for years to do this. I just knew that it was what I wanted to do. But nobody made money writing symphonies anymore. So I had to do something else, and I could write pretty well. So I thought, well, maybe I could get into journalism. That's a job, because I had already been working at the Madisonian, the paper in my hometown of Madison. And I thought, well, I could get a degree in that and work in newspapers. I could do that. But then I thought, maybe that's looking backward. Maybe I should look forward. Maybe I should get a job in TV. So I applied for it and was admitted to what was then called the radio TV film sequence of the journalism school. I think and I think Bill Anderson talks about this maybe in his interview, but it was advertising was one, advertising, public relations, news, and then radio, TV, film. Radio, can you imagine majoring in radio now? But at any rate, that's what I chose. And so I decided that, you know, it would be a good thing to do. As it turned out, I have never to this day set foot as an employee in a commercial television station. I have written and co-produced 3 documentaries, but that's about it. That's as far as it went. And I did do some work while I was working at the University of Georgia as a TV producer and reporter for a morning show. So I've had a lot of work in video, but nothing like what I thought I was preparing for. What it was like then was the studio was pretty well equipped for the late 60s, early 70s, but the cameras we had were, I think, all secondhand cameras from Atlanta TV stations. It required an unfathomable amount of candle power to light those cameras. And so the studio had to be kept freezing cold all the time because of the hot lights. And they were supposed to sort of balance it out, which it didn't. In front of the lights, it was about 67 maybe, and behind the lights, it felt like it was about 30. And, you know, it was always freezing in there. But we learned how to do everything with radio, TV, and film. We learned how to run a radio board. We learned how to do announcing for radio. We learned how to edit videotape, which is what we did at the time, with a razor blade and tape. Insane as that will sound to anybody who knows anything about video now. It was so much earlier than the digital era that it's almost incomprehensible to think about the technology. But we did the best we could with what we had, and we used 3/4-inch black and white videotape, and for projects and things. We had to for the film sequence, we had to make short films. I took a photography class and had to take pictures with a 4x5 camera. I did all that stuff that sort of fell then under the rubric of journalism. And I had some very good classes and I had some good times, but I knew long before I started my senior year that I was never going to do it for a living. I also knew that I couldn't change majors because I couldn't afford to. I was going to have to stick with it and get this degree and just do it. So I did, and I graduated on time in 4 years, which is not that hard to do back when I did it. It's almost impossible now. But at any rate, I just did whatever we were supposed to do. It was fun, and I had a lot of really bright classmates, extremely bright classmates, who have gone on to do some things with their lives in journalism. And I've always been a news hog, and still to this day am, somebody who's really wants to be out on the edge of finding out what's going on. It's just that most of what people want to know now is not what I wanted to know then or now. So I'm having to try to find places now where I can find it out. But it's easy enough to do. It's just, I think it was part of the era. There was so much happening that everybody wanted to know about, that we all did. And being the first ones to find it out, to be the first one to hear the bells ring from a flash on an AP machine was quite a thrill.
That's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when I was at the Athens Daily News, I was heard the bells ring for the Paris Peace Accords, and for when LBJ died, when Spiro Agnew was indicted. And in fact, I saved those. In fact, the several of those I had the actual printouts, AP printouts, that wound up in my papers that I gave to UGA. I think one of them was when Pablo Casals died. I don't know, when Picasso died, I had the original AP printout of that.
Interesting. Do we need to visit anything else about the University of Georgia? I know your favorite memory of the university. I know what you would say.
Well, my favorite memory of the University of Georgia was meeting Linda.
And if you didn't say that, I was going to suggest that Bill erase it and that you do say it, but I knew that's what it was going to be.
It was, I don't know, it was an odd kind of thing. What happened was, I was in it was a Biology 102 lab. And we were in there, and I had an open seat next to me. And as was typical, I was always early. I'm always early to everything. Whatever it is, I'm always early. It's a real character flaw. But Linda is always, unless pushed, is always late. And so she was the last one coming to class. And she came flying in, this girl with real long, straight hair, parted in the middle, with bell-bottom jeans on, with "War is not healthy for children and other living things" patches on her pants. She had on a carmine sort of velvety coat that looked like something maybe that Mick Jagger could wear. I mean, she just bowled me over, and the only place to sit was next to me. And she sat down, and I said, "I'm Phil." And she said, "I'm Linda," but I thought she said Melinda. And I said, "Your name's Melinda?" And she said, "No, I'm Linda." And then she rolled her eyes like that and everything. And she was not into Southern boys at all. And she thought, I know she was thinking, "Oh God, what have I gotten into here?" So that whole quarter, though, it turned out she already knew one of my best friends, Joan Norton from Madison, because she knew her from Myers. She lived in Myers Hall with her. So that was very odd that Joan knew Linda before I did. But that whole quarter, I kind of tried to make some time with her, and it just nothing at all, no way at all. End of the quarter, goodbye, and I was like, well, typical Phil Williams love story. But at any rate, the following fall. The first day, we started in September then, it was a gorgeous fall day. And I was walking by the Bulldog Room, by Memorial Hall, and on the west end of Memorial Hall, and I heard psst, just like that. And I looked up, and there she was, sitting there calling me. She was sitting there with this another girl, and Linda was sitting there with a cigarette in one hand, and I think a lighter in the other hand. God, she looked so cool. And, I know I'm sounding like I'm something out of the way we were now, but it really was, she really, really was that striking. But I couldn't remember her name.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I went over and we chatted, and fortunately, her roommate called her name. And I went, Linda. Her name's Linda. So, and I think I put this in the book. I said I was not going to, at this point I was like, I'm not going to screw this up. She's going to have to tell me to get out of her life. It's going to come to that. And I said, ask her for her phone number, and she gave me her phone number. And I said, well, maybe I'll call you. And she said, yeah, if you want to. And I'm like, ugh, yeah. So I did. And the first date we had was one of the real heights of insanity I've ever been involved with. I thought I was taking her to the Georgia game, and, I was going to buy her a mom. I mean, it was just like 1950s. But as it turned out, the people going, and I didn't know any of this, were Linda, her mother and father, her roommate Kathy, Kathy's boyfriend, Kathy's parents, her roommate Clark's parents. And so we all went over to Linda and Kathy's apartment before the game, got totally drunk. Afterwards, we were really messed up, and by about 11 o'clock, we decided we'd better eat something. So we decided we'd take off in the middle of the night and drive to the Swamp Guinea. So we managed to get up there in one piece. And I have these places where my memory just has holes. We're sitting there laughing. I'm sitting there laughing with a can of Falstaff in my hand at their apartment. The next thing, I'm holding a fork and looking at catfish. And how did I get here? I don't have any memory of going from this place to this place. But it was a nutty first date. I mean, it was about.
When the Swamp Guinea was out in the boonies.
It was way out in the boonies in Madison County or somewhere.
Yeah.
But at any rate, but it was great. And the last thing I remembered was one of the fathers, and I won't say which one. We were getting ready to leave, and he had had way too much to drink, and he started filling up his suit coat pockets with catfish, just stuffing them in there. And I'm like, this isn't like Madison at all. But I really had no idea what I had been hit by. But that was Linda's world. Her world was just that different from mine. And I was like a moth flying into a candle. And I thought, okay, she's going to have to, basically destroy my life to get rid of me. And I just stayed with it until I finally wore her down. And we've been married for 43 years now.
Let's talk about your life as a journalist.
Sure.
Phil, you've worked Madisonian, Clayton Tribune, Athens Observer, Athens Daily News. And if I say, because your book is so wonderful, and I know we can't hear everything, but if I say, can you give us a quick cut line on each one of those places and what you remember?
The Madisonian was hugely important to me because I started working there when I was a kid. Adelaide Ponder and Graham Ponder, who owned the paper, she was the editor, he was the publisher, and they were both from Madison, took a chance on me. Adelaide started publishing my poetry when I was in high school, which was a crazy thing to do, and it was horrible, but she loved me. And then later I worked there when I got injured in graduate school, working at the University of Georgia bookstore after I had left the Athens Daily News and went back to Madison and worked there full time. But when I started there as a young person, got all my clips, it was a great place to work. I learned how to write obituaries. I learned how to write a feature story, how to do a news story, how to report, how to look at the world as a reporter looks at the world, which is vastly different. It's more like an artist looks at the world and more like a detective looks at the world. You have to see everything in a different way if you're going to do it successfully. My first professional job was with the Clayton Tribune. My cut line for the Clayton Tribune would probably be worked way too hard, should have been fired, but wasn't. What happened was I got hired to write all the stories. I got hired as what was I called? Managing editor, maybe, I forget. But I was it. I was the whole staff. I sold all the ads, wrote all the stories, took all the pictures, developed and printed all the pictures, laid the paper out, and about half the time I had to take it to get printed over in Murphy, North Carolina, which is where the paper was printed. It was a chain paper at that time, and it just about killed me. It just about killed me. And I did it for only 6 months. And that was the summer right after I graduated from college, from UGA. And Linda wanted me to go to graduate school. We had this gigantic argument because she'd already been accepted and she was going to go straight back to graduate school, mainly because she didn't want to work. And so, and I was like, no, I want to work. I want to go out. And I mainly thought, I really did want to get out. I didn't want to go straight to graduate school. But I also had a big sense that if I really wanted to get her, I was going to have to prove to her and her family that I could go out and get a professional job and get a paycheck and be somebody who you could pull my weight as a mate. And so we had this huge breakup, and not a breakup, but a huge departing scene when I left and went to Clayton. She went back to Atlanta for the summer, but I told her, I said, I will drive from Clayton to Decatur, which is where she lived, and see you every weekend if you'll still date me. And she said, okay. So I did. And I would leave on Friday afternoon, and I would drive back to Clayton I would leave at 4 o'clock on Monday morning to get back to Clayton. And about halfway through that summer, I was there one weekend, and she said, I've been thinking about something, because I'd asked her to marry me months before, and she said no. She said, no, I'm not ready for that. And I said, okay. And that summer, though, she said, I've been thinking about something. And I said, what? She said, about getting married. And I said, and she said, I think I want to. I said, really? And so we got married on September the 30th, 1972, when I was still in Clayton at the Clayton Tribune. So she moved up I was living at that time in this ghastly little three-room shack at the foot of Black Rock Mountain in Mountain City, Georgia. And I bet
I know where you were.
We just drove by there. We were up there this summer. Well, we took Megan and her boyfriend, our daughter Megan and her boyfriend, up to go ruby mining, something I've been doing since the 50s. And we drove by it. We drove up to halfway up the mountain to look for it, and it's gone. It's been eaten by weeds. The whole thing's fallen and disappeared. But it was an actual house, and it had 3 rooms. But we only had one chair, so we took turns sitting in the chair. But we also, one other brief sidelight of that house was that it had a tin roof. And the cable TV had just come to the mountains, and a TV cable went over our tin roof. And in those days, they had not yet learned how to shield the cables. So with our rabbit ears on our black and white TV, we were able to pick up the TV cable because it was leaking from the cable into our tin roof and turning our entire roof into an antenna. So we got to watch the 1972 World Series with the Oakland Athletics back when they had all the mustaches and everything, Raleigh Fingers and Catfish Hunter and all them on TV, which we never would have been able to do otherwise. And we felt like we'd won the lottery. But that was a tough job because it was so hard, and I worked like 70, 80 hours a week, and I made $110 a week. And I had already applied at the Athens Daily News, and in November, late November, the phone rang one day, and it was Bob Chambers from the Athens newspapers asking me if I was still interested in working there. And I said, yeah, I am, because Linda really wanted to get back to graduate school. And I said, yeah, I am. And he said, well, can you come down and interview? And I said, sure. So I set up a time to do it, took a day off, and went down, and they offered me a job as copy editor of the Daily News. Now, the Daily News and the Banner Herald were the same paper at the time, and the Daily News was a morning paper, which meant you had to work at night. I didn't want to work at night, but I wanted to get back to Athens. So after 6 months at Clayton, when I did a pretty bad job, I think, although I tried hard, God knows I tried hard, but it just was way more than what one person could really do. We were on our way back to Athens. One thing I did do, though, was that as a newly minted progressive, I was probably the only weekly newspaper in the continental United States that endorsed George McGovern for president.
I bet in Clayton.
Yeah, I got threatened by a lot of people. Yeah, it was pretty stupid. But we packed up and moved back to Athens. And what would my cut line for the Athens Daily News be? Learned everything I knew about journalism and more at that place from 2 geniuses Eugene Plott Bryce and Johnny Futch. Plott was the city editor. He's just passed away a couple of years ago. Johnny is still alive and well, lives in California. And Johnny was the sports editor, and they were both geniuses. I mean, they were beyond brilliant, and they were only 4 or 5 years older than me. But that gap of me being 22 and them being in their late 20s was everything. They had it down. They knew all about running a newspaper, and I had no idea what I'd gotten into. It was brutally hard too. But I learned really, really quick. I jumped in the stream, and I really learned very quickly how to do it. And I got good at it really quickly, which surprised me. It was a lot of fun. Our our associate editor, who was in charge of the Daily News at the time, was Larry Young, who was an extremely conservative older guy, who actually also was a brilliant journalist. He was a great old-time reporter. I mean, really good. But he hated all of us because we all had long hair and we all had liberal opinions and everything, and we fought all the time, which made it fun for us. We really loved that too. But it was a time when a lot of things happened. I learned so much about the business of journalism, about the practice of journalism at the Athens Daily News. I remember one stringer brought in a Little League story or a football story or something one time, and Johnny Futch, the sports editor, read it, looked up at him over his glasses like this, and Futch was this tough Vietnam veteran. I mean, I was a little afraid of him, but he was just brilliant at what he did. But he took his lighter out of his desk and held up the kid's copy and set it on fire in front of him and looked at him straight in the eyes like that, and then dropped it in his trash can, his metal trash can. He said, "Do it again." And the kid said, "Yes, sir." And he went and did it again and did it the right way the second time. I never forgot that. And I thought, holy crap, I don't want to get on the wrong side of this guy. But it was, I was there a year. But while I was there, I also decided that I really wanted to go back to graduate school. So I took the GRE, got admitted, and so for a time there, I was working full-time at the Athens Daily News from 2 o'clock till midnight, pretty much every day, 5 days a week anyway, 6 days a week. And I had a full load in graduate school. And I was young, but I was, I should have been smarter than that. I don't know. Linda was working at the UGA library, and we were both in graduate school in English. I wanted to be a writer. She really wasn't sure what she wanted to do other than not be out in the real world. And we couldn't see where it was going exactly. So, and I knew I just couldn't keep doing it. I couldn't keep working at the Daily News. So that's when I got a job working at the University of Georgia bookstore part-time. We had 2 part-time jobs between us so I could go to graduate school. I got injured working at the bookstore. I mean, badly injured to my back, and couldn't work anymore. So at that point, it was like, what do we do? We're going to starve to death because we just barely had enough money for pizza and beer. That was what we could keep ourselves in, because we lived in 5 Points and bought, God, what a place that was. It was great. We lived in the basement of a home place, and it was fun. But, Boxcar Pizza was right across the street. There was a liquor store right there. There was a laundromat up there. I mean, we had everything.
All your needs were being met.
That was it. But we didn't have enough money to pay for that in our apartment either. So that's when one Sunday, Linda and I drove to Madison, and I met with Adelaide and Graham Ponder to see if I could get a job working at the Madisonian and get back into journalism full time. And I knew that you don't make much money on a weekly paper, even the owners don't or anything, and I knew it would be marginal for them at best to hire somebody else. So I asked them if they would pay me $5,200 a year, and they said they would do that. And so the cut line for the Madisonian, and I was there from 74 to 78, would be, it was where I learned everything. It really was where I learned. It was the place where I learned how to be an adult in a professional job. I screwed up a lot, but I did a lot of good things too. The first couple of years I was there, I was pretty good. But by the second or third year I was there, I had gotten really good. and I knew it. I realized that I was good, and I wanted to get better. And I suddenly, this thing kicked in that I wanted to be the best that I could be at everything that I did. And I started writing a novel too, and it was beyond horrible, but it was, I made myself do it, and what time I could carve out to do it. But I worked hard, and just as hard as I could at the Madisonian. We won hundreds of awards, and state and national awards, and I was really proud of that. But I had been fine, and so but I realized it was time to leave. I really wanted to. I was 28, and I really wanted to get to a place that suited me better. And I had known about the Athens Observer, this populist progressive newspaper in Athens, for a long time. And 1 week in the summer of 78, I got a letter from 2 of the 3 owners of the Observer praising me for the work I'd done at the Madisonian. And neither one of them knew the other one had written to me. One was from Pete McCommons, the other one was from Chuck Searcy. And I was like, I'm not going to let this opportunity pass. So I wrote them back immediately, wrote letters in those days, and said it had been my dream to work at the Observer, and this is an opening. Could we talk? And Pete wrote me back and said, yeah, let's talk. And so we got together and had a beer on a Friday afternoon late, not too long after that. Turned out they weren't ready to hire anybody yet. And I was just as happy, because I really was not quite ready to jump up and move. But very quickly they were. And I didn't find out till later that what was behind it all was that Chuck was leaving to work in the Carter administration in D.C., and they were going to be really shorthanded. And they had never had a trained editor, academically trained editor before, somebody who'd actually been to journalism school. And I was really up and coming. So in 78, I left to go to the Athens Observer, where I stayed for 7 years. The cut line for the Athens Observer, God, the best newspaper I ever knew when it was at its best, the most exciting place to work and the most exhausting. It was a thrill a lot of days. We had a staff we could not remotely afford. The people who worked there were the best that we could get at every position. The people in production were the best production people in Athens. The people in photography and the writers, everybody, were all the best. And how they afforded it and didn't go bankrupt immediately, I don't know. And we limped along for years. Well, the Observer was an important paper for a long time. It was a paper that didn't just cover the university in a way that never had been done before, but it was a paper that actually went out and found out what people in the community were doing in a way that the daily papers had never done and really haven't done since. I am absolutely confident that at its best, the Observer was the best newspaper that Athens and Clark County has ever had. And when I say at its best, I mean from 1979 to 1983, maybe. The last couple of years that I was there, we weren't as good because I wasn't as good. I had already published my first novel in 1984 and knew that I desperately wanted to have time to write, and that I was never going to have time to write, that if I stayed in journalism. It just wasn't going to happen. So that was the point at which I started looking around to find another job, and I knew if I could find one, it would be at the University of Georgia, and that it would probably pay me more anyway, because in journalism you get paid nothing. We got paid in adrenaline, and we got paid well. We were millionaires when it came to adrenaline. I remember one time my phone rang on a Saturday, and Lee Scherer said, "You better get the hell down here." I said, "What's happening?" He said, "There was just a shooting at the police station right across the Washington Street from us, from our office, which was at the offices which were on North Lumpkin, right before you get to Washington." So I jumped in my car, went flying down there, broke every speed law there was, and went flying upstairs, loaded a camera, and went back to the corner office. Just as they were bringing the shot police officer out on a gurney, he survived. The guy that shot him was tracked down and killed. But I leaned out the window just as they were bringing him out with my camera, and click, 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 and I got the only shots of that shooting that
Something
were published.
out of a movie.
It was like the front page. And, it was that kind of thing you can live off of for weeks and weeks and weeks. It wasn't about money. It was about how good can you be. And everybody was enraged at anybody who was less than as good as they could be.
No dog in it.
None, whatever. And it was, and in fact, there were a lot of arguments if anybody felt like somebody was not pulling their weight. So it was, at its best, a spectacular paper. It was a great place to work. Pete and Chuck and Don Nelson and Chatham Murray McCommons, just Chatham McCommons then, Chatham Murray now, were brilliant. I mean, really, and I mean that sincerely, brilliant and fun to work with and be around. And my education continued very, very big there. And of course, Pete gave me one of the greatest gifts of my life, because I let him read my first novel, which I thought was pretty bad, but I knew it was bad when he said he thought it was funny and it was supposed to be serious. And he basically ripped it apart and told me he thought it was just junk. And I kind of felt like I knew what he was going to say, but it was the greatest single gift as a writer I ever got from anybody at any time, because I knew at that point, and I talk about this in the book, that I was either going to have to get a lot better or I was going to have to quit. So I decided to try to get a lot better. That was just my nature. And that was when I wrote The Heart of a Distant Forest. And I remember when Pete first read The Heart of a Distant Forest, having only read the really bad first novel that I had given him, he thought that, I had gone to Mars and come back and been, had my brain replaced, because he couldn't believe the same person had written these two things. But The Heart of a Distant Forest happened because I decided to write about nothing except what I knew and what I really, really, really loved. And so I made a list. I wrote at the top things I really love. And so I was going to write about that, and that's what I did. And it shows. It shows that the things I wrote about and the way I wrote about them were passions that I had. But that all happened while I was at the Observer too. First book.
Talk about leaving newspaper, and what did you do?
I left because I really didn't think I was ever going to write another book if I had to stay, because it eats you alive, newspaper business does. Certainly in those days it did. It's very different now, because everything's done on computer now. But in those days it was not at all. We had computers toward the end when I was there, but when I started the Observer, we were still using typewriters and having to typeset everything. But I knew I was going to have to leave, and so I also, and this is another thing that just has been lightly touched on, but we opened a television station called Observer TV. And I was made, because of my background in TV, I was made vice president and executive director of Observer Television. So I was there, it was in the same building but in a different place. And so Chuck and I did that after he came back from D.C. For several years, and it was brutally hard. But then the Observer went to twice weekly, which was a gigantic mistake, which everybody agreed was, trying to pay for a huge staff we couldn't afford. And it almost killed Pete, who was editing then. He had to take some time off to regain his health. So they moved me back to be editing paper again. So, all this back and forth went on all the time, and it was typical of the era, that it was like, oh, you be editor for a while and I'll be publisher. No, I'll be queen and you can be, and literally those kinds of conversations went on. And Pete, when he came back, decided he wanted to be editor again, and I just was like, no, this is, I need to do something here. This is too destabilizing for me, although it worked for a lot of the people there. And in retrospect, who cares? But, at any rate, I thought, I'm going to see if I can get a job at the University of Georgia. I need to be thinking about retirement anyway. So I walked over to the Human Resources building, and all the jobs were put on 3x5 index cards and pinned to the board. I mean, this is, back in ancient days. It was way pre-internet. And so anyway, and one of the first ones there was for a editor-writer in the College of Agriculture. And I grew up in the country, was very rural-oriented, loved agriculture, and I thought, man, I could do that. I think I could do that. So I put in an application, and they interviewed me, and they had about 20 applicants for the job, 25, and they would have a lot more than that now. But, by that time, I was an award-winning journalist who had worked for 3 papers. I'd published my first novel, which had been accepted very well, had been reviewed in the New York Times, and had done, for a book like that, done very well, and had come out in paperback and sold like 30,000 copies in paperback. It just had done very, very well. So I got the job, and I felt very fortunate because, it was something that I could do from 8 to 5 and not on weekends, and could guarantee the fact that I would not have to take work home, which I never did, rarely, just once in a blue moon. And I also realized I was going to have to make the kind of money I wanted to make, I was going to have to take more responsibility as it became offered to me. So there was, Randall Kofer was running both the communications office and the extension service, and I was in the experiment stations section of the College of Agriculture. And my job was to write about scientific research, something that I did for many years after that at UGA, 27 years in fact, and loved and got very good at, and found it just right, suited my chops and everything. But I had the opportunity to then be in charge of that whole office, then be in charge of all of the offices all over the state. And I did that for some years, several years, and then after that I worked in the college's Office of Public Information, as it was called then, or Public Information, for I think 5 years as senior science writer. And then they rearranged everything, and I became the Director of Public Information for the College of Arts and Sciences. And I did that for a number of years, and my title when I finally retired from UGA was Assistant Dean for Public Information for the College of Arts and Sciences. So, I had this whole long career as a writer at the University of Georgia, as well as having gone there, and and wound up with a beautiful retirement plan and everything. And during that time, I was able to write books at the same time and carry on my creative career, and they fit each other beautifully. And I also got a lot of encouragement from my bosses and from the administration at the university for continuing to do that, to do my work at UGA and also to carry on my writing career at the same time. And it was hard. I mean, it was really, really hard, but a lot of people do 2 jobs.
Talk about your writing routine. I think the world needs to know.
My writing routine has largely been unchanged for years. I'm a morning person. I'm very much an early morning person, and I have always gotten up about 4 o'clock. And I will get up. I used to get up and make a cup of coffee and think about things and fiddle around, do this and that, and then write. When we lived on off the Jefferson Road, after I won the Townsend Prize for the best novel written by Georgians, I won it in 1986. I got a check for $500, which was a fortune to me then. It's not much now, but then it seemed like a lot. But I used the money to buy lumber, and my father and brother and I built me a writing cabin out behind our house, still there. And in this cabin, I would go down every morning. I had a little heater, but it was great. And it sat in the woods, and I would go down there every morning, and by 4:30, 5 o'clock, I was working on my book. And I would write for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then come back, take a shower, and go to work. And for all these decades since, even since I've retired, I get up early, go up and fiddle around, check websites I like, and then I will start working on whatever project I'm working on. So, and I have never worked more than 2 or 3 hours in one day. Two hours working or editing on a manuscript is exhausting. It's physically exhausting. It's emotionally brutal. And over all of these years, I have finished probably close to 40 books. I don't know. I have never really counted them. But some didn't work for one reason or another, or I couldn't get together with a publisher for another, or this editor didn't like it and that one did, or I decided to put it on the shelf. I had one book one time that I wrote that I quit on the word "the" right in the middle of a sentence. And I said, this is just utter crap. What am I doing? And so I just set it aside. And I came back 6 months later and read it up to "the," and it was still crap. And I did it again like 2 years later, and, I was just, that was a misfire, 240-something pages.
Golly.
But, when you do this so much and everything, the danger is becoming too facile, you become too good at it. And you can't, because it's too hard, and it's a brutal business with a lot of rejection and a lot of U-turns and a lot of directions that you think you're never going to go in.
Never say never.
Well, I told Linda from the very beginning she knew from day one when we started dating that I wanted to be a writer, and that I was going to work hard, and that I really was going to have to fail spectacularly to quit. And often. But I told her, I said, I'm not going to try to write the same book over and over and over. And I want to try to be a literary writer. I want to write something that will last, something that will make a difference. And some books may make us a pretty good bit of money. Some may make us nothing. And she said, that's fine. And that's what I've done. That's what I did. And I've had books that have made a lot of money, and I've had books that have made nothing.
Living the dream, though, that's and meeting your goals. Phil, there's so many of us out there who may have had a dream or may have a dream, and the fact that you've have made it. I have the quote, one of the quotes from your book. I really did once upon a time live my dream in the Big Apple as I rode across town in a taxi cab to a party thrown by a random house. Yeah. Talk a little bit about the things that we fantasize about, those of us who've never published a book, about book signings and meeting famous people, and then talk about the things that are really important to you about publishing a book.
Okay. I had friends tell me, my buddy Raymond Andrews, who is also a member of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, and one of the closest friends Linda and I ever had. We both loved him like a brother. I mean, he was, we still are upset that he killed himself, and it's been almost 25 years now. But Ray told me, because he published his first book long before I did, but Ray told me, although, to back up, we published his first fiction in a literary magazine that we started called Ataraxia back in the early 70s. But Ray said, enjoy your first book because the experience is never the same after that. And I had a lot of other writers tell me the same thing. So when my agent, what happened was with my first book, I wrote The Heart of a Distant Forest, which was the first book that was published. And I liked it. I gave it to Linda to read. She said, that's not bad, which from a Bostonian is very high praise. She's not given to gushing. So, I thought, okay, well, and I put it in a drawer and left it there for a year. But then I started feeling like I ought to try to do something with it. I was scared. Everybody's scared. Me, be a published author, or Arthur, as they said in Madison when I was a kid. Why, how could I be an Arthur? And but I thought, okay, well, I'm going to send it to Peachtree Publishers in Atlanta. They had published Pharoah Sams' first book, Run of the Horseman. And I didn't know Sambo then. I got to know him real well later. But the editor there read my book and called me up and said that, he loved it, but they really weren't publishing that much fiction. That Sambo's first book was really all they'd done so far, and they really weren't sure. This looked like a good book, but not very commercial. Would I mind if he sent it to, he had a good friend in New York, and his daughter was just starting as a literary agent in Manhattan, and would it be okay if he sent it to her? And I said, yeah. So he sent it to Molly Friedrich, who became my first literary agent. And suddenly I went from having this finished manuscript in my desk that nobody had read but Linda, to having a literary agent in New York. And she called me up and she said, I want to be real blunt with you about this. I love the book. I don't think I can sell it. If I do sell it, I don't think it's going to sell. This is the exception, not the rule, but I'll do what I can. And I said, wow, I'm really grateful. So I went from being nobody to having a literary agent all at one time. And this was back in the day when having an agent was a really, really big deal. It's not so much anymore, but it really was in those days. So she sent it immediately to several presses, all of which were interested, every one of them. Doubleday was interested. Houghton Mifflin came within a gnat's eyelash of buying it. 2 editors there, including Robin Macaulay, who had been the fiction editor at Playboy, where he had edited Vladimir Nabokov, among other people, loved it. But the editor-in-chief of Houghton Mifflin killed it right at the last minute when it looked like it was going to be published there. Doubleday almost bought it. Simon & Schuster almost bought it. But then the first press to make an actual offer on the barrelhead was W.W. Norton and Company. So Molly calls me up, and I'm sitting there at the Observer, in the office with Pete. We were sharing an office, Pete McCombs. And she says, she said somebody had turned it down, some big press. She said, but we do have an offer on the table from Norton. I said, what? Would you say that again? She said, we got a small offer from W.W. Norton. And I said, tell me about the editor. So we talked, and I didn't know this until sometime later, but one of the people I mentioned in my novel was Dee Brown, who wrote Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, a book that had a huge impact on my life. And as it turned out, Tom Wallace, the editor at Norton who bought my book, was Dee Brown's editor at Holt for Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. So it was, one of those things where the universe suddenly becomes symmetrical after being in complete and utter chaos. And here I am not believing from one day to the next what is happening. So Molly says, so you want to do that? And I said, do I want to do it? Yeah, I want to do it. And she said, great, okay, well, I'll call them and tell them, we'll get to work. So I hung up the phone, and Pete could tell what was happening on the phone when he knew that I had just sold the book. And I hung up the phone, and he looked at me, and he said, what? And I said, W.W. Norton just bought my book. And he said, then you're coming with me. And he stood up and came to my desk, and I stood up, and I was completely numb. I knew I wanted to call Linda, but she was a school teacher, and they don't get anybody out of a class for that kind of news. So she was going to have to find out when I got home that night. So he took me I knew where we were going. We were going to a bar. So we walked up the street to Friends, our bar of choice, where we lived half the time. And it was a joke among most journalists that if nobody knew where they were, they'd be between City Hall and the courthouse, which meant we would be in the bar. A lot of drinking in those days. But anyway, he bought me a Manhattan, and which I thought was, and he thought of it just like that. I mean, he had it all figured out before we got out of the door of the Observer. And we sat there and drank like 3 of them, ghastly drink. Ugh, it was horrible, but I thought it was the best drink I ever had in my life. But that moment, that first moment, never comes again like that. It was an amazing moment. Then things happen. You have trouble, you don't sell this, you don't sell that, and everything. My next novel, a novel called All the Western Stars, Molly hated my agent, and she tried 2 or 3 places in New York who didn't want it, and she said, I hate to do this, but I'm just going to have to send it back to you, and we're just going to have to give up on this one. And I thought, I have an idea. Chuck Perry is now the editor at Peachtree Publishers, and I had known Chuck when we were he was at the Banner Herald and I was at the Daily News. Old Athens boy, and I had known him off and on for years. And so I said, would you be willing to look at some manuscripts of mine? He said, yeah, I'd love to. So I sent him 4 finished novels that I had. And then we were going to meet. And he took 3 months or something like that. And of course, the whole time I'm going crazy. And he calls me up and says, where can we meet in Athens? And we agreed on meeting at History Village. And we went over there and met and had lunch. And he bought 3 of the 4 novels at one meeting.
That was a good lunch.
No kidding. And I was in shock, and I thought, well, I'm not sure if this is a good idea or not. Small publisher in Atlanta. As it turned out, it was a great move for me, because when the book came out, it immediately got rave reviews everywhere. We sold the paperback rights immediately, and every movie company in Hollywood lined up because it got a spectacular review in Publishers Weekly, and wound up selling the movie rights to MGM. And, I mean, my life suddenly was wildly different. We were really on the verge of poverty. We had, at that time, until we were in our mid-30s, late 30s, we never had more than $300 in the bank. And so suddenly, out of nowhere, the wolf was getting further away from the door. So all this wonderful stuff began to happen, and books came and were published, and I was on tour all the time, it seemed like, and going places. And in the early 90s, I had this book that was real dark. By then, I was with an agent named Harvey Klinger. Harvey was a ball of energy, and he and I fought endlessly all the time. But he felt like this manuscript would be good for a brand new imprint of Random House that was just opening, called Turtle Bay Books. And they had just done a big, huge feature story on Turtle Bay Books in the New York Times, and they were considered newsworthy because all the editors, like five of them, all the editors of the whole house were women. And they were all brilliant and mostly young, and it was a real different kind of thing. And so Joni Evans, who was in charge of it, loved my book. And so she bought it. And at that time, my advance was, and you talk about in terms of money and everything, and this is in the book, so it's not privileged or anything, but my advance was like $67,000 or something like that, which, people think, you mean you didn't get $10 million or something like that? No, but that's a lot of money for a lot of people. So I got a big advance, and I was in New York anyway that year for the American Booksellers Association convention at the Javits Center on the west side. And Joni found me there at the convention, and we got a cab back over to Turtle Bay's new brownstone. They had a whole brownstone on West 57th Street. And we actually worked on the manuscript in there. And that night there was a party there that all the bigwigs of Random House came to, and it was written up in the papers and everything. And I was messed up. I had gone over to Harvey's. Harvey had a house in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, but he also had an apartment in Midtown. And we went over to Harvey's place, and I drank all afternoon. And then we went to the party, and I drank, and and it was he was pulling me away to get me off of bigwigs, whom I was, hanging on and acting like they were my best friends. But I knew, I had a sense that this was ridiculous and would never come again. I mean, I had already done, by that time I had already, was it then? I forget. Anyway, one time I went out for drinks with people from MGM and Hollywood, but anyway, this party was the party of all parties. It was an amazing kind of thing. And finally, about midnight, Harvey took me out and took me over to where was it? A Planet Hollywood or something, and tried to get me to drink a Coke or something like that. But I remember him putting me in a cab and sending me back down to the Penta, the Hotel Pennsylvania, which is right across from Madison Square Garden. It's changed names back and forth over the years, but I think it was the Penta at the time. But I remember lying in the back seat, looking out the window at the stars like this, thinking, F. Scott Fitzgerald has nothing on me. And, it was just, and I knew it was ludicrous, and I knew it was crazy. And the only thing I really wanted to do is to go home. I just wanted to come back to house and live the quiet life. But I flew close enough to the fire to get burned many times in my career, and most times it was a lot of fun.
That sounds.
And
amazing.
A lot of things
Yeah.
happened. A lot of parties, a lot of running into a lot of well-known people. I did a lot of work with film. I had movie deals with Ron Howard and Meg Ryan, and things like that. And never met either one of them, but my people met with their people. Kind of stuff. But it was all enjoyable. But I always kept calibrated where I wanted to go. And I had a good sense there after a while that I was not going the direction I wanted to go. That New York was probably not going to, the kind of books that I could get in New York were not the kind of books that I really wanted to be writing at that time. So I started thinking about smaller presses and university presses. That led me to the University of Georgia Press, and then finally to Mercer University Press, where I published a number of books. And those books did very well, and they're books I'm very proud of, particularly The Flower Seeker, which is an epic poem about William Bartram. Nobody but Mercer would have printed that. They were just crazy. But I'm just thrilled that they did. And so, I have balanced over the years that necessity for wanting to write things that may matter, at least they have a chance of mattering, against things that I wanted to write as entertainments or to do as entertainments. Jenny Dorset, it was a book that Peachtree did that, Longstreet Press did that book, and also in Atlanta. But it was a book that could be seen either as an entertainment or as art, because it's sort of a mock Henry Fielding 18th century novel about this crazy young woman in Charleston during the French and Indian.
Tom Jones of.
Very much so, and intentionally so, with the same kind of language. But it's a screamingly funny book, and kind of sad at the end. But that was a lot of fun. And A Distant Flame, which St. Martin's did in 2004, again back to New York, because it was a book that I didn't want to be published by a smaller press because it was more of a big press book about Southerners who are against the South's position in the Civil War, something never been written about in fiction, and really not much in history either. Tom Dyer's book came out, and Tom and I were both doing research on the same thing at the same time, and I knew his was the important book much more so than mine was, and it has remained a seminal book on Southerners who were not part of the South's position during the Civil War. And Tom and I were good buddies and hung out a lot and talked about that stuff a lot. And it was sort of my backhanded way of writing a civil rights novel. I never could get it right, but writing about this seemed to work for me. But it took me 10 years, and it was a lot of fun. But I thought I was never going to get it finished. So, everything that I've done as a writer, talk about people, who want to know about what it's like and everything, it's mostly like writing the world's longest grocery list. It really is. You have to think about, you go into the grocery store, you have to think, okay, how am I going to do this? I'm going to think of how things are laid out at the store so I don't have to run back and forth from one side to the other, or I'm going to think of what I need, or maybe what I want, or who's coming to town, or with a novel, you're constantly weaving different aspects together, and it never ends. They say novelists never finish a book, they just have them taken away, and that's pretty much true. But for me, I'll do a whole pass through a novel on nothing but verb tenses. I will look at every verb tense intensively, and it'll take weeks and weeks. I'll do one on proper nouns, a pass through the whole manuscript. I'll do a whole pass on adjectives. Then I'll do content passes and then I'll do character passes where I'll touch up or eliminate or cut. The book I'm working on right now is like 428 pages, something like that. And I'm on like the 6th or 7th pass on it now, and I'm not even remotely close to being finished. So it's mostly what most people would consider drudge work. For me, the first draft is like a blueprint, when I finish the first draft of a novel, I have the blueprint. And that's the point at which I get really happy, because what comes after the blueprint is the part that's fun, the rewriting. I'm a rewriter. That's what I am. I'm an editor. And anytime I can find a point that I can make better, or a character flaw that I can improve, or a point of conflict that I can increase or decrease as the context of the narrative requires. Each time I find one of those small things, if it takes me 2 hours or 4 hours or 3 days to find that and to make it right, to me, I'm doing what I was meant to do, which is to be an artist. I don't, who was it? Truman Capote said that about Jack Kerouac, that's not writing, that's typing. I want to be somebody of whom it is said he tried to write. He succeeded sometimes, and a lot of times he didn't, because most of the times we don't. But, that's what I wanted to be able to say. And it all fits together, in my head, of where I have come from my childhood through my university years, as a journalist, as a science writer at the University of Georgia, and as a poet and a novelist, and as a composer too, which has been a passion since childhood. It all fits together in my mind, and it all comes back to that intersection of arts and sciences that I was raised with. It's all feeding back to where I started, and I can look at it and go, yeah,
it's beautiful and almost scary.
That's the gift I was given. Yeah. If you're given a gift, or if you have a gift, your job is to do something with it. And I have known too many people with extravagant gifts who have done nothing with their gifts. And it requires patience and an ability to fail with good humor. Buddy, I have failed.
Phil, you mentioned already, but you've won the Townsend Prize for fiction, which recognizes the best novel published by a Georgian during the past 2 years. You've won, 4 Georgia Author of the Year awards in 3 categories. The Michael Shara Award for A Distant Flame, which is the best Civil War novel. Is that correct?
Published in the United States, yeah.
You've been installed in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. You've received the Governor's Award in the Humanities. You've been recognized with a resolution by the Georgia State Legislature. You mentioned something else today that I was not aware of. So you've been, if being lauded helps you to know that you've done with your gifts the right thing, or what you've used your gifts in the very best ways, and we're all blessed by that. But take 1 minute and talk about your wonderful family. 2 minutes. Talk about your wonderful family.
I was blessed to have a mother and father who knew what was important in life and what wasn't. What wasn't important when we were growing up was money. What was important was the arts and the sciences and education. I was lucky beyond belief to have found Linda, because she is, she is literally the other, or figuratively, but literally too, the other half of me. I mean, she really is the only reason I've succeeded in doing anything. Because she is a tough audience. She is a tough audience, and she wouldn't let me get away with anything. Our kids, Brandon and Megan, are the lights of our lives, and as are our grandchildren. Our extended families also are congenial and fun. The life I have lived has been a life with a lot of humor, with a lot of irreverence, but with a real serious attitude toward what is possible for a human to do. And, whether it's archaeology, which my brother does, or teaching nurses, which my sister does, or doing the things I have done, one of the things you find out quick, and this is something I taught my kids, is that being really good at something is a lot more fun than being mediocre at everything. And the better you get at something, if you pick one thing, get great at it. And if you get great at one thing, pick something else and get great at it. Not because you owe it to the world, or not because it's proving anything about who you are, but because it's fun. It makes life so much more fun when you master something. And if you teach people that, they get it. They understand that. But it's hard. It requires time and labor to get really great at something. So my family has been everything. They have been made me everything that I am. And thank God for the University of Georgia. I don't know where I would be without that. And it like I say, it all fits. It all makes sense. And there are a lot of days when I don't make sense to anybody, but
what a great note to end on.
But I'm trying still, and I will always try to do the best I can to make my world as I see it have some value and meaning to everybody else.